All right. We left up working on this example where we had some pages for a zoo that had pictures on it. We started out with 2 pictures, a page about lions with 2 pictures of a lion. Let's review this. Again, we were first going to create the HTML for this page, and then we were going to go and apply any CSS that we wanted to the page. All right, and that's sort of a good approach to take. You could do it whatever way works for you. Some people like to build the HTML and the CSS alongside each other in parallel. Some people like to do all of the HTML and then style it via CSS. It really doesn't matter. I mean, if you end up at the same place, you end up at the same place. All right, so that's really up to preference. One thing I like to do is I like to develop all the HTML first and then go and add the CSS. And we'll go through that because in addition to covering images, one of the things I want to do is review CSS. Now we talked about resizing the images. First of all, notice that this is sort of nonsense words. This is what's called Greek text. Sometimes it's used as a placeholder for regular text. There's online, there's websites that allows you to generate that. And you would put that in if you didn't have the actual paragraph that's going to belong there. Maybe someone else is writing it for you, a lion expert, for example. So you might go and just, it's going to be a paragraph about this long, so you put that in as a placeholder. All right. So let's look at the code, and let's review the tags for the images. Remember, for HTML, the question always is, like, what's the tag? So if you want to know how to do an image, well, what's the tag to do an image? And the tag to do an image is this. It's an example of a tag that does an image. Let's look at it. It has 2 attributes. An image will very nearly always will have 2 attributes associated with it. An SRC attribute and a alt attribute. The SRC attribute is the file that contains the image. All right, the file of the image. A couple things about that is that it needs to be the exact file name. We talked about file extensions last time. So the 3 main file types that are supported for images on a browser are PNG, GIF files or GIF files, depending on how you prefer, and JPEG files. But keep in mind that JPEG files can have a number of different extensions. Some JPEG files end in a .jpeg, and some end in a .jpg, and so on. So you have to get that exactly right in order for it to work. This is assuming that everything's in the same folder. If it's in the same folder, like we have here, then all you need to do is put the name of the web page, or not web page in this case, but image. Every image will also have what's called an alt attribute. And what this is it's a short explanation of what the image is, and it's used for people that can't see the image and access the web page through a screen reader. We'll talk more about assistive technologies and accessibility and screen readers later on in the course, but a screen reader essentially narrates the page to the user. It reads the text that appears on the page. And when it comes to an image, well, how do you read an image? You can't do that. So instead, what it will do is it will read the alt attribute. So it will tell the user what is contained in the alt attribute. Notice that this is an image tag is a starting and ending tag rolled into one. All right. I could write it like this if I wanted to. But there's never going to be anything between the start and end image. All right, this is a little different than most of the other tags. I could actually leave off the ending tag, and that's legal. But I generally like to make sure all of my tags have start and ending tags, so I use this shorthand. And then implements what's called an empty tag. In other words, it's a starting and ending tag rolled all into one. We talked about how important it is, if you're going to change the size of the image, to retain a copy of the original. Let's take a minute to demonstrate what I mean by that, just so that's perfectly clear. I have a copy of the original, so I don't have to redo that. I have that backup made. I'm going to take this lion image, and I'm going to copy the desktop. And I hope you can see this on the monitor. If I open this up in Paint, I can go in and I can change the size of the image. Let's see, where do I do that? Pardon me? Yeah, there we go. Resize. Let's say I'll make this real small. I'll make it 5% of the size that it originally is. It's important, by the way, to do things in the same proportion. And by default, this is checked to maintain the aspect ratio. So for example, if I made it 50% as horizontal, but 10% vertical, it's going to squash the image like that. I'll go and do that. If I did the opposite, if I made this 10% and made this 50%, then it's going to sort of stretch it out that way. So it's important to do both of them in the same direction. It always bothers me. I always see that as a sign of real amateurishness when I see an image that's not resized properly, and it either looks squashed or stretched out. It just I don't know. It just doesn't look like a well-done professional website. So if we're going to change the percentages, we're going to change both of them the same amount. Let's say I take an extreme view, and I make this, again, 10% of its size. So I make the line real small. And I go and I save this. Then I go and decide, well, wait a minute, that image was way too small. Let's make it bigger. If I go back in and try to edit it, notice at that point it's a little hard to see, but the image is small, but it's still clear. All right. If, however, I take a real small image like that and I try to make it bigger, like I increase from 80 by 62 to 800 by 620, then, and I think you can see there, the line looks fuzzy. All right. So in a nutshell, you can make an image smaller and it will retain its quality. It'll just be a smaller version. You can't make an image bigger. All right. Once an image is made smaller, that information is gone. So you can't regain that information. Whatever program you're using takes a guess at what that information should be, and it's not going to do a good job, and it's not going to be very clear. So for that reason, always have a backup of your images, which we do in this case. I have a separate folder that contains the original, and there you go. All right, so I'm going to make the other image match the size of this image. If I want to know the size of the image, I can right mouse on it on Windows and say Properties, and it'll tell me that it is 800 by 619. So I can go and I can do the same thing with this image. Oh, I'm looking at the original file. Here's where I want to look. So this image is 300 by 232. So I'll make this one match. Well, it doesn't exactly match because apparently, but again, I'm going to match the horizontal size of them. Or I can match the vertical size of them if I wanted to. And I can save it. Now I have this. And if I view the page, it looks like that. All right, not bad. All right. Notice that this sort of implies that images are not block tags. Images are inline tags. What's the difference between a block tag? Well, paragraphs are block tags. In other words, I have two paragraphs here. By default, unless I change something in the CSS, they're going to be stacked on top of each other. First paragraph and the second paragraph. Images, however, are stacked if there's enough room for them alongside of each other. Now, that's sort of a key disclaimer. There has to be enough room for them. So if I go and I make this browser window very, very, very small, then there's not enough room for this along that, and it will put it underneath it. But if there is sufficient room, it will put them side by side. Yes?
What order should we have those pictures in? Say if we put pictures in the right or wrong, what kind of layout those pictures should be better?
Well, that's a good question. We haven't really focused on the layout yet. We're going to start to get into that a little bit today, talking about CSS for layout. But essentially, I guess I would say just whatever makes sense for you, whatever looks good. You know, you're going to use pictures in a number of different ways in your web pages. You know, let's imagine we had a bigger article about lions. You know, we might talk about the male lion, and then, well, in the middle of that, maybe you have a picture of a male lion, and then talk about the female lion. Well, in the middle of that, you have a picture about the female lion, then a bit about lion cubs. Well, then you have a picture. So you lay it out in a way that makes sense for what information you're trying to explain. And I hate to use this, but the story that you're telling. You know, you can talk about this, you know, creating web pages in a way as you're telling a story. It's sort of a simplified way to put it, but you are. And therefore, you're going to arrange the images in a way that makes sense for the story that you're trying to tell. All right? All right. So, let's play around with the CSS for this. And when I do it, I'm going to play around with a couple of things. I'm going to review some of the things that we went over, and I'm going to talk about a couple new things. All right. Remember, I said as we cover CSS, we're going to go a little bit of CSS, a little bit of HTML, and so on. So I'm going to do a couple of new things with the HTML and CSS in this example. First thing I'm going to do is let's think of a color scheme for this. What do you think would be a good color scheme for a zoo? Pardon me?
Brown and yellow.
Brown and yellow. All right, let's go to this guy. And let's pick somewhere in here. Well, we can pick where we want. I'll pick this, for example. So, again, we have 4 colors that this gives us. Or am I counting wrong? No, there's actually 5 colors there. If you think about it, we talked about using color purposefully, using things that contrast and things such as that. Therefore, you don't want to use too many colors. If you use too many colors, it's overkill, and nothing really gets emphasized. But if you carefully pick the colors and just maybe change up a color here or there, you can really sort of really showcase the stuff that you want to showcase without overwhelming the user. All right? So this is probably good enough for a start. I'm going to make the page this color. So this color is FF F7AA. So I'm actually going to go and I'm going to create a brand new file. And I'm going to set a selector for the body to make everything on the body have the same background. I don't remember what I said that was. FF F7AA. If you're into these hex codes, there's a lot of red and green in this. Red and green make yellow, which isn't really intuitive, but that's the way it works. And then a little bit of a blue, so it's not really a pure yellow. So that would contribute to the sort of brownish kind of shade of yellow that this is, for lack of a better word. All right, so I'm creating this. I'm going to put my CSS file in a folder, and I'll call it style.css. And now every one of my pages is going to use that style file. So I'll go in here and I'll say link. And this is a different sort of link than a link you click on. This is a link that says tie this page to this CSS file. href equals the name of the CSS file. Rel equals style sheet. Type equals text/CSS. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to test this to make sure that it works. A big thing about really web development and any sort of software development is you want to test frequently. You don't want to like spend 6 hours working on code and then go and test it to make sure it looks good. All right, do a little bit of coding, do a little bit of testing. That helps you isolate where things went wrong. So like if this works, and the CSS works, I make a change, and it stops working, well, there's a good chance that it's that last change that I made that messed it up. As opposed to spending 2 hours writing code, then testing it, and nothing works. You have no idea where it went wrong. So this is about as simple of a CSS file as you can have. All I'm doing is I'm changing the background color of the body. If I didn't get this right, then something's really wrong. And I want to know about it, right? I want to know about it right away. And it could be a couple things that are wrong. Maybe this code is wrong. Or maybe the way that I link the file is wrong. But the point is there's no sense trying to do more CSS if this doesn't work. If this doesn't work well, figure out what's wrong, correct it, and then you can go and add some CSS. So I'm going to save everything and hit refresh here. And yeah, that works. All right. One thing, by the way, that I don't think I mentioned is you can always consider white, black, and shades of gray as being fair game, especially white and black. All right. Shades of gray, I guess that would depend on the color scheme, but white and black definitely almost don't count when you count the colors, you know. So, you know, I mentioned that you have, this color scheme gives you 4 or 5 colors. 4 or 5 colors typically is going to be plenty. You know, you have a main color, you have a few accent colors, all right. But then if you want some extra things, you have black and white to deal with. All right. So I'm going to go and I'm going to make my H1s have a different color. And I'm going to say, give me a background of 554D00. And I'll make the color be this. All right. I could just as well maybe make that color white and it would work as well. All right, we've had enough fun with colors, all right, for now. So we're not going to play around with the colors of this page. We could literally make everything on the page have a different color. That's not a good idea, right? Because then nothing would really stand out. This is the only thing that's different on the page, so that stands out. That's your header. It jumps out at you, and you can easily see what that is. All right. Other things we're going to do with this. I'm going to go and change the font of the page. All right. Now, there's there's actually three main styles of fonts. There are serif fonts, sans serif fonts, and what are sometimes called def fonts, where it might look like it's handwritten or something like that. Generally speaking, I kind of avoid these. That's just my taste, but I don't know. Usually for the kind of stuff that I do, that doesn't really look professional. And I guess there's times when to use them, so I'm not going to say like absolutely don't use them, but if you're going to use those, be really sure that it works and be really sure it's appropriate for what you're doing. Now, serif versus sans serif fonts. The serifs are these little thingies here. So this is a serif font. This is a sans serif font. Because it doesn't have thingies. All right? Now, they're easier to read. Well, a lot of times, sans serif fonts are used for smaller print because those serifs don't really get in the way, all right, and make it hard to read. But a lot of times, the serif fonts are used for like larger headline things. So you can have a mix of them. Fonts are almost like colors, though, right? You don't want a mix of 10 different fonts on your page. Maybe 2 or 3 different fonts on your page is just enough. All right? Now, I'm going to open up Word to look at some fonts, just for the heck of it. Identify whether they're sans serif or not. And talk about how fonts sort of have their own feel, just like colors sort of have their own feel. Fonts sort of have their own feel. I'm going to make the font size really, really big so we can see it. That is Calibri. No, you can't. You have to guess. Use your memory. Come on. You guys used Word before. This is Calibri. We'll make it really, really big. Is that a serif or a sans serif font? Sans serif, right? You don't see the little D-leads here. All right. Next one we will do will be a classic You know it, you love it. Times New Roman. All right, this is a serif font. All right. Now, speaking of fonts that you know and love, Comic Sans. And we're not going to use that one. All right. But again, I mean, it is available. You want fonts that go together. You want fonts that reflect your site. There's certain like standbys, just like there's certain standby colors, right? Like if you don't have an organization, let's say, that really has a logical color scheme that goes with it, then just make the page, white background and black font. I mean, that's like a classic. No one's going to tell you did wrong. It's like if you're going to a fancy event, and as a guy, you wear like a blue suit, with a white shirt and a tie. You can't go wrong dressing like that. You're not going to look out of place, right? Whereas if you're a real snappy dresser, maybe you could come up with a real wild, outfit that looks great. But, maybe that, maybe you're not, don't have something like that in your repertoire to pull off. So like this example. In this example, an earthy sort of color scheme makes sense because it's zoo pictures, outdoors, animals, nature, and all that. But if it was, again, some other organization that, the American, manufacturers of plastic, what color scheme is good for that? I don't know. Then just go with the classics, white and black, and you'll be okay. Fonts are almost the same way. But fonts can be used to be very expressive. For example, if you go to their website, they have a very distinct font that's meant to sort of, what do I want to say? Pardon me? Distinguish them, yeah, and identify them, and as part of their branding even. I mean, the fonts are the same on everything they sell. So if you went to the store and you bought an iPad or you bought a laptop or whatever, it'd be the same font and all that. So it's that's part of the brand recognition is using the font. And it's meant to look sleek and modern and so on. So you can use fonts sort of the same way that you use colors to sort of create an association with your brand. We're going to play it simple here, and we're going to pick, and again, we're going to be boring, all right? But I'm not going to be that. I'm going to go with Times New Roman. Let's pick a different serif font. I'm going to pick Garamond. All right. And if you think I'm obsessively looking and talking at about fonts, this is nothing. Talk to a real hardcore graphic designer. If any of you have Netflix, watch the film Helvetica, if it's still on there. It's a documentary about a particular font. All right, believe it or not, like a 90-minute movie. And people really, really, really obsess about these things. We're going to sort of obsess about them. By that I mean we're going to care about them, and we're going to pick something that we think looks good, but we're not going to sweat it. I'm going to go with Helvetica and not Helvetica, Garamond, and I had another one in mind and I just lost it in my head. Recognize it as I see it. We're going to use that for the headlines, and we're going to use Tahoma for the rest of the page. Now, here's the thing. If I say Garamond and Tahoma, there are some machines that don't have Garamond and Tahoma installed. All right? depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC and depending on how old it is, or maybe you have a Linux machine or whatever, not all machines have the same fonts. All right? So when you specify a font, typically what you do is you specify a list of fonts. All right? So I'm going to specify in the body font family Garamond Times New Roman, and finally serif. And my headings, I'm going to say, oh, no, I don't want that. That's what I want for the headings. I'm going to specify for this, Tahoma, Arial, sans serif. So I'm making the whole page have that, except for my H1s. And I'll do it for the H2s as well. So I look at that. My two headings, H1s and H2s, have the serif font. The rest of my page has the sans serif font. All right. Now, how does it work with the multiple fonts? The browser tries each font until it gets a hit, until it gets a winner. All right. And by winner, I mean that font is installed on that machine. Yes. Good question. What if I only put one font and computer doesn't have it? Let's try it. Let's make up a font. Let's pretend that somewhere out in the world there's a font called Zellers. All right? So I'm going to make the font family Zellers. All right? So this machine doesn't have it. So what do you think it's going to do? Pardon me? Exactly. It's going to default to the browser's default font. So we haven't put a font on there yet, right? This is like the first day that we're putting fonts on there. Yet we had a font. What font was it? It was the browser's default. So if we don't have a font that matches this list, that matches one of them on the list, it's going to use the browser's default. So hit refresh. This is back to good old Times New Roman. All right? So if it doesn't have any, then the browser uses its default. Remember, that's always what the appearance of your page is composed of. The browser's defaults plus what you put in the CSS. Now, if I put a second font here, if I said Zellers, comma, Arial, then it doesn't find Zellers, but it finds Arial. All right? I can even specify not a specific font, but the generic serif or sans serif font. Because the browser actually has two default fonts. It has a serif default font and a sans serif default font. So if I specify Zellers and I give the generic name of sans serif, it will use the browser's favorite sans serif font, whatever that browser is installed. And I think I messed up by not having a dash there. There we go. there's like some fonts that go together an awful lot of the times. In other words, you'll see, because what it is it's like sometimes there's a Windows version of a font, then there's like a Mac version of the font, and then the generic font. So a classic in web development is Helvetica, Arial, Sans Serif. Helvetica is, again, a very popular font. All right? Arial is sort of the Microsoft's version of Helvetica. They didn't want to pay the owners of the Helvetica font money for it, so they made up a font of their own that looks exactly like it. Finally, if you happen to be on some really oddball machine that doesn't have either of those, you'll use the browser's favorite or default sans serif font. We can Google popular font combinations. And oh, this is approaching it differently. This is approaching it between headline and text. Okay, here's an example of fonts that go together. And so on. So typically what you would do is you would use fonts that like looked close enough. Definitely you would match serif fonts with other serif fonts. All right. We're going to do one more trick today, all right, and then we'll call it quits. One thing that can be difficult is if the text goes all the way across the page, all right, it doesn't necessarily look good, and it can be actually hard to read. If I'm reading this, if I'm reading a very wide column of words, my eye has a tendency to either go up or go down. All right, as I'm going up, I tend to either go up or tend to go down if it's wide across. That's why newspapers, they don't print all the way across the page, right? Because that would be very hard to read. They break things down into columns, because columns are easy to read. Your eye doesn't have to travel as far. So one thing that we could do is we could make this page so it doesn't go across the width of the entire screen. All right? So we can do that by giving a width associated with it. So I'm going to add a few more tags here. I'm going to add a header. And I'm going to add an article tag. Sometimes people refer to these kind of tags as containers, because they sort of contain other code. Then I'm going to give the container and the header a width. save all. And there we go. It doesn't go all the way across. It only goes part of the way across. So this is 700 pixels going across. What's a pixel? A pixel is essentially a dot on your screen. Your screen is a collection of a bunch of little tiny dots. All right? And on this particular screen, there's about 1,000 of them going vertically and about 800 of them going, no, 1,000 of them going horizontally and about 800 of them going vertically. So I can do 700 pixels and that will be that. If I do pixels, then notice what happens. If I make the screen bigger or smaller, doesn't matter. Keeps everything the same width. So if I do this, if I make my screen narrow, then I have a scroll bar. I could also use percentages. All right? So I could say width equals 70%. And then, as I view this page, it automatically resizes the page to match the size of the window. Now, where do you think something like this might be good? Pardon me? Almost everywhere. Absolutely right, because it resizes itself. You have a big monitor, gives you a big web page. You have a small monitor, you have a small. If you take it to the extreme, if you're on a mobile device, it will take and make it so that it fits on the width of your screen. Now we're going to do one last thing with this before we call it a day. And we'll continue with this. Again, we're talking about images, but we're also slipping in some new CSS. We'll get back to talking about images next time, a little bit more. But the one thing that you can do is by adding in this code, and I'm just going to show this to you, and we'll talk more about it later. But if I wanted this centered, because this looks okay, but it might be nice, boom, just centered right in the middle of the page. So I could do this and say margin 0 pixel auto. And what that will do is that will center that. Notice that the browser's smart enough. When there's enough space to put the images side by side, it does it. When I make those things smaller by resizing it, it makes the images automatically smaller. Now we can do some cool stuff here too, right? I could make the background of the header and the article this, and make the background color of the page white. If we want to. I made the background of the body white, and then I made the background color of the header and article be those particular colors. So now we have a little picture frame almost around it. That's a real nice thing to sort of give the user focus on the content. Now, coming back to images, guess what? We could put an image as a background of the body. And then we have this little frame around it that's comprised of an image. Maybe a nice pattern. Or maybe something wild animal-like, right? Because this is a zoo page. All right? And that's where we'll pick up next time, and we'll play around with it. It's kind of hard to start talking about CSS, because when you start talking about CSS, as I'm looking about this, I'm like, what can I do to make this page look better? And I'm just adding things, and pretty soon we're going to talk everything possible about CSS. But we'll come back to this next time and start doing more things with images. All right, we'll see you in lab.